Chapter 20 of The House of the Seven Gables. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. Recording by Madeira. The House of the Seven Gables by Nathaniel HAWTHORNE. Chapter 20 The Flower of Eden. Phoebe, coming so suddenly from the sunny daylight, was altogether bedimmed in such density of shadow as lurked in most of the passages of the old house. She was not at first aware by whom she had been admitted. Before her eyes had adapted themselves to the obscurity, a hand grasped her own with a firm but gentle and warm pressure, thus imparting a welcome which caused her heart to leap and thrill with an indefinable shiver of enjoyment. She felt herself drawn along, not towards the parlor, but into a large and unoccupied apartment, which had formerly been the grand reception-room of the Seven Gables. The sunshine came freely into all the uncurtained windows of this room, and fell upon the dusty floor, so that Phoebe now clearly saw, what indeed had been no secret, after the encounter of a warm hand with hers, that it was not Hepzibah, nor Clifford, but Holgrave to whom she owed her reception. The subtle, intuitive communication, or rather the vague and formless impression of something to be told, had made her yield unresistingly to his impulse. Without taking away her hand, she looked eagerly in his face, not quick to forebode evil, but unavoidably conscious that the state of the family had changed since her departure, and therefore anxious for an explanation. The artist looked paler than ordinary. There was a thoughtful and severe contraction of his forehead, tracing a deep vertical line between the eyebrows. His smile, however, was full of genuine warmth, and had in it a joy, by far the most vivid expression that Phoebe had ever witnessed, shining out of the New England reserve with which Holgrave habitually masked whatever lay near his heart. It was the look wherewith a man, brooding alone over some fearful object in a dreary forest or illimitable desert, would recognize the familiar aspect of his dearest friend, bringing up all the peaceful ideas that belong to home and the gentle current of everyday affairs. And yet, as he felt the necessity of responding to her look of inquiry, the smile disappeared. "I ought not to rejoice that you've come, Phoebe," said he. "We meet at a strange moment." "What has happened?" she exclaimed. "Why is the house so deserted? Where are Hepzibah and Clifford?" "Gone. I cannot imagine where they are," answered Holgrave. "We are alone in the house." "Hepzibah and Clifford gone?" cried Phoebe. "It is not possible. And why have you brought me into this room, instead of the parlor? Ah, something terrible has happened. I must run and see." "No, no, Phoebe," said Holgrave, holding her back. "It is as I have told you. They are gone, and I know not whither. A terrible event has indeed happened, but not to them, nor, as I undoubtingly believe, through any agency of theirs. If I read your character rightly, Phoebe," he continued, fixing his eyes on hers with stern anxiety, intermixed with tenderness, "gentle as you are, and seeming to have your sphere among common things, you yet possess remarkable strength. You have wonderful poise, and a faculty which, when tested, will prove itself capable of dealing with matters that fall far out of the ordinary rule." "Oh, no, I am very weak," replied Phoebe, trembling. "But tell me, what has happened?" "You are strong," persisted Holgrave. "You must be both strong and wise, for I am all astray, and need your counsel. It may be you can suggest the one right thing to do." "Tell me, said Phoebe, all in a tremble. "It oppresses, it terrifies me, this mystery. Anything else I can bear." The artist hesitated. Notwithstanding what he had just said, and most sincerely in regard to the self-balancing power with which Phoebe impressed him, it still seemed almost wicked to bring the awful secret of yesterday to her knowledge. It was like dragging a hideous shape of death into the cleanly and cheerful space before a household fire, where it would present all the uglier aspect amid the decorousness of everything about it. Yet it could not be concealed from her. She must needs know it. "Phoebe," said he, "do you remember this?" He put into her hand a daguerreotype, the same that he had shown her at their first interview in the garden, and which so strikingly brought out the hard and relentless traits of the original. "What has this to do with Hepzibah and Clifford?" asked Phoebe, with impatient surprise that Holgrave should so trifle with her at such a moment. "It is Judge Pyncheon. You've shown it to me before." "But here is the same face, taken within this half hour," said the artist, presenting her with another miniature. "I had just finished it when I heard you at the door." "This is death," shuddered Phoebe, turning very pale. "Judge Pyncheon dead." "Such is there represented," said Holgrave. "He sits in the next room. The judge is dead, and Clifford and Hepzibah vanished. I know no more. All beyond is conjecture. On returning to my solitary chamber last evening, I noticed no light, either in the parlor, or Hepzibah's room, or Clifford's. No stir nor footstep about the house. This morning there was the same death-like quiet. From my window I overheard the testimony of a neighbor that your relatives were seen leaving the house in the midst of yesterday's storm. A rumor reached me, too, of Judge Pyncheon being missed. A feeling which I cannot describe, an indefinite sense of some catastrophe or consummation, impelled me to make my way into this part of the house, where I discovered what you see. As a point of evidence that may be useful to Clifford, and also as a memorial valuable to myself, for Phoebe, there are hereditary reasons that connect me strangely with that man's fate. I used the means at my disposal to preserve this pictorial record of Judge Pyncheon's death." Even in her agitation, Phoebe could not help remarking the calmness of Holgrave's demeanor. He appeared, it is true, to feel the whole awfulness of the judge's death, yet had received the fact into his mind without any mixture of surprise, but as an event preordained, happening inevitably, and so fitting itself into past occurrences that it could almost have been prophesied. "Why have you not thrown open the doors and called in witnesses?" inquired she, with a painful shudder. "It is terrible to be here alone." "But Clifford," suggested the artist. "Clifford and Hepzibah. We must consider what is best to be done in their behalf. It is a wretched fatality that they should have disappeared. Their flight will throw the worst coloring over this event of which it is susceptible. Yet how easy is the explanation to those who know them? Bewildered and terror-stricken by the similarity of this death to a former one, which was attended with such disastrous consequences to Clifford, they have had no idea but of removing themselves from the scene. How miserably unfortunate! Had Hepzibah but shrieked aloud, had Clifford flung wide the door and proclaimed Judge Pyncheon's death, it would have been, however awful in itself, an event fruitful of good consequences to them. As I view it, it would have gone far towards obliterating the black stain on Clifford's character." "And how," asked Phoebe, "could any good come from what is so very dreadful?" "Because," said the artist, "if the matter can be fairly considered and candidly interpreted, it must be evident that Judge Pyncheon could not have come unfairly to his end. This mode of death had been an idiosyncrasy with his family for generations past, not often occurring, indeed, but when it does occur, usually attacking individuals about the judge's time of life, and generally in the tension of some mental crisis, or perhaps in an access of wrath. Old Moll's prophecy was probably founded on a knowledge of this physical predisposition in the Pyncheon race. Now, there is a minute and almost exact similarity in the appearances connected with the death that occurred yesterday, and those recorded of the death of Clifford's uncle 30 years ago. It is true, there was a certain arrangement of circumstances unnecessary to be recounted, which made it possible, nay, as men look at these things, probable, or even certain, that old Jaffrey Pyncheon came to a violent death, and by Clifford's hands." "Whence came those circumstances?" exclaimed Phoebe. "He being innocent, as we know him to be." "They were arranged," said Holgrave. "At least such has long been my conviction. They were arranged after the uncle's death, and before it was made public, by the man who sits in yonder parlor. His own death, so like that former one, yet attended by none of those suspicious circumstances, seems the stroke of God upon him, at once a punishment for his wickedness, and making plain the innocence of Clifford. But this flight, it distorts everything. He may be in concealment, near at hand. Could we but bring him back before the discovery of the judge's death, the evil might be rectified." "We must not hide this thing a moment longer," said Phoebe. "It is dreadful to keep it so closely in our hearts. Clifford is innocent. God will make it manifest. Let us throw open the doors and call all the neighborhood to see the truth." "You are right, Phoebe," rejoined Holgrave. "Doubtless you are right." Yet the artist did not feel the horror which was proper to Phoebe's sweet and order-loving character at thus finding herself at issue with society, and brought in contact with an event that transcended ordinary rules. Neither was he in haste, like her, to betake himself within the precincts of common life. On the contrary, he gathered a wild enjoyment, as it were, a flower of strange beauty, growing in a desolate spot and blossoming in the wind. Such a flower of momentary happiness he gathered from his present position. It separated Phoebe and himself from the world, and bound them to each other by their exclusive knowledge of Judge Pyncheon's mysterious death, and the counsel which they were forced to hold respecting it. The secret, so long as it should continue such, kept them within the circle of a spell, a solitude in the midst of men, a remoteness as entire as that of an island in mid-ocean. Once divulged, the ocean would flow betwixt them, standing on its widely sundered shores. Meanwhile, all the circumstances of their situation seemed to draw them together. They were like two children who go hand in hand, pressing closely to one another's side, through a shadow-haunted passage. The image of awful death which filled the house held them united by his stiffened grasp. These influences hastened the development of emotions that might not otherwise have flowered so. Possibly, indeed, it had been Holgrave's purpose to let them die in their undeveloped germs. "Why do we delay so?" asked Phoebe. "This secret takes away my breath. Let us throw open the doors." "In all our lives there can never come another moment like this," said Holgrave. "Phoebe, is it all terror? Nothing but terror? Are you conscious of no joy, as I am, that has made this the only point of life worth living for?" "It seems a sin," replied Phoebe, trembling, "to think of joy at such a time." "Could you but know, Phoebe, how it was with me the hour before you came," exclaimed the artist. "A dark, cold, miserable hour. The presence of yonder dead man threw a great black shadow over everything. He made the universe, so far as my perception could reach, a scene of guilt and of retribution more dreadful than the guilt. The sense of it took away my youth. I never hoped to feel young again. The world looked strange, wild, evil, hostile, my past life so lonesome and dreary, my future a shapeless gloom, which I must mold into gloomy shapes. But, Phoebe, you crossed the threshold, and hope, warmth, and joy came in with you. The black moment became at once a blissful one. It must not pass without the spoken word. I love you." "How can you love a simple girl like me?" asked Phoebe, compelled by his earnestness to speak. "You have many, many thoughts with which I should try in vain to sympathize. And I, too, I have tendencies with which you would sympathize as little. That is less matter, but I have not scope enough to make you happy." "You are my only possibility of happiness," answered Holgrave. "I have no faith in it, except as you bestow it on me." "And then I am afraid," continued Phoebe, shrinking towards Holgrave, even while she told him so frankly the doubts with which he affected her. "You will lead me out of my own quiet path. You will make me strive to follow you where it is pathless. I cannot do so. It is not my nature. I shall sink down and perish." "Ah, Phoebe," exclaimed Holgrave, with almost a sigh, and a smile that was burdened with thought, "it will be far otherwise than as you forebode. The world owes all its onward impulses to men ill at ease. The happy man inevitably confines himself within ancient limits. I have a presentiment that hereafter it will be my lot to set out trees, to make fences, perhaps even in due time to build a house for another generation. In a word, to conform myself to laws and the peaceful practice of society. Your poise will be more powerful than any oscillating tendency of mine." "I would not have it so," said Phoebe earnestly. "Do you love me?" asked Holgrave. "If we love one another, the moment has room for nothing more. Let us pause upon it, and be satisfied. Do you love me, Phoebe?" "You look into my heart," she said, letting her eyes drop. "You know I love you." And it was in this hour, so full of doubt and awe, that the one miracle was wrought without which every human existence is a blank. The bliss which makes all things true, beautiful, and holy shone around this youth and maiden. They were conscious of nothing sad nor old. They transfigured the earth and made it Eden again, and themselves the two first dwellers in it. The dead man, so close beside them, was forgotten. At such a crisis there is no death, for immortality is revealed anew, and embraces everything in its hallowed atmosphere. But how soon the heavy earth-dream settled down again. "Hark!" whispered Phoebe. "Somebody is at the street door." "Now let us meet the world," said Holgrave. "No doubt the rumor of Judge Pyncheon's visit to this house, and the flight of Hepzibah and Clifford is about to lead to the investigation of the premises. We have no way but to meet it. Let us open the door at once." But to their surprise, before they could reach the street door, even before they quitted the room in which the foregoing interview had passed, they heard footsteps in the farther passage. The door, therefore, which they supposed to be securely locked, which Holgrave, indeed, had seen to be so, and at which Phoebe had vainly tried to enter, must have been opened from without. The sound of footsteps was not harsh, bold, decided, and intrusive, as the gait of strangers would naturally be, making authoritative entrance into a dwelling where they knew themselves unwelcome. It was feeble, as of persons either weak or weary. There was the mingled murmur of two voices, familiar to both the listeners. "Can it be?" whispered Holgrave. "It is they," answered Phoebe. "Thank God! Thank God!" And then, as if in sympathy with Phoebe's whispered ejaculation, they heard Hepzibah's voice more distinctly. "Thank God, my brother, we are at home." "Well, yes, thank God," responded Clifford. "A dreary home, Hepzibah, but you have done well to bring me hither. Stay, that parlor door is open. I cannot pass by it. Let me go and rest me in the arbor where I used, oh, very long ago, it seems to me, after what has befallen us, where I used to be so happy with little Phoebe." But the house was not altogether so dreary as Clifford imagined it. They had not made many steps. In truth, they were lingering in the entry with the listlessness of an accomplished purpose, uncertain what to do next, when Phoebe ran to meet them. On beholding her, Hepzibah burst into tears. With all her might, she had staggered onward beneath the burden of grief and responsibility, until now that it was safe to fling it down. Indeed, she had not energy to fling it down, but had ceased to uphold it, and suffered it to press her to the earth. Clifford appeared the stronger of the two. "It is our own little Phoebe! Ah, and Holgrave with her!" exclaimed he, with a glance of keen and delicate insight, and a smile, beautiful, kind, but melancholy. "I thought of you both as we came down the street, and beheld Alice's posies in full bloom. And so the flower of Eden has bloomed likewise in this old, darksome house to-day." End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of The House of the Seven Gables. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. Recording by Madeira. The House of the Seven Gables by Nathaniel HAWTHORNE. Chapter 21. The Departure. The sudden death of so prominent a member of the social world as the Honorable Judge Jaffrey Pyncheon created a sensation, at least in the circles more immediately connected with the deceased, which had hardly quite subsided in a fortnight. It may be remarked, however, that of all the events which constitute a person's biography, there is scarcely one, none, certainly, of anything like a similar importance, to which the world so easily reconciles itself as to his death. In most other cases and contingencies, the individual is present among us, mixed up with the daily revolution of affairs, and affording a definite point for observation. At his decease there is only a vacancy, and a momentary eddy, very small as compared with the apparent magnitude of the ingurgitated object, and a bubble or two ascending out of the black depth and bursting at the surface. As regarded Judge Pyncheon, it seemed probable, at first blush, that the mode of his final departure might give him a larger and longer posthumous vogue than ordinarily attends the memory of a distinguished man. But when it came to be understood, on the highest professional authority, that the event was a natural and, except for some unimportant particulars, denoting a slight idiosyncrasy, by no means an unusual form of death, the public, with its customary alacrity, proceeded to forget that he had ever lived. In short, the Honorable Judge was beginning to be a stale subject before half the country newspapers had found time to put their columns in mourning and publish his exceedingly eulogistic obituary. Nevertheless, creeping darkly through the places which this excellent person had haunted in his lifetime, there was a hidden stream of private talk, such as it would have shocked all decency to speak loudly at the street corners. It is very singular how the fact of a man's death often seems to give people a truer idea of his character, whether for good or evil, than they have ever possessed while he was living and acting among them. Death is so genuine a fact that it excludes falsehood, or betrays its emptiness. It is a touchstone that proves the gold and dishonors the baser metal. Could the departed, whoever he may be, return in a week after his decease, he would almost invariably find himself at a higher or lower point than he had formerly occupied on the scale of public appreciation. But the talk or scandal to which we now allude had reference to matters of no less old a date than the supposed murder 30 or 40 years ago of the late Judge Pyncheon's uncle. The medical opinion with regard to his own recent and regretted decease had almost entirely obviated the idea that a murder was committed in the former case. Yet, as the record showed, there were circumstances irrefragably indicating that some person had gained access to old Jaffrey Pyncheon's private apartments, at or near the moment of his death. His desk and private drawers in a room contiguous to his bedchamber had been ransacked. Money and valuable articles were missing. There was a bloody handprint on the old man's linen, and by a powerfully welded chain of deductive evidence, the guilt of the robbery and apparent murder had been fixed on Clifford, then residing with his uncle in the house of the Seven Gables. Whencesoever originating, there now arose a theory that undertook so to account for these circumstances as to exclude the idea of Clifford's agency. Many persons affirmed that the history and elucidation of the facts, long so mysterious, had been obtained by the daguerreotypist from one of those mesmerical seers who nowadays so strangely perplex the aspect of human affairs, and put everybody's natural vision to the blush by the marvels which they see with their eyes shut. According to this version of the story, Judge Pyncheon, exemplary as we have portrayed him in our narrative, was, in his youth, an apparently irreclaimable scapegrace. The brutish, the animal instincts, as is often the case, had been developed earlier than the intellectual qualities, and the force of character for which he was afterwards remarkable. He had shown himself wild, dissipated, addicted to low pleasures, little short of ruffianly in his propensities, and recklessly expensive, with no other resources than the bounty of his uncle. This course of conduct had alienated the old bachelor's affection, once strongly fixed upon him. Now it is averred, but whether on authority available in a court of justice we do not pretend to have investigated, that the young man was tempted by the devil one night to search his uncle's private drawers, to which he had unsuspected means of access. While thus criminally occupied, he was startled by the opening of the chamber door. There stood old Jaffrey Pyncheon in his night-clothes. The surprise of such a discovery, his agitation, alarm, and horror, brought on the crisis of a disorder to which the old bachelor had an hereditary liability. He seemed to choke with blood, and fell upon the floor, striking his temple a heavy blow against the corner of a table. What was to be done? The old man was surely dead. Assistance would come too late. What a misfortune, indeed, should it come too soon, since his reviving consciousness would bring the recollection of the ignominious offense which he had beheld his nephew in the very act of committing. But he never did revive. With the cool hardihood that always pertained to him, the young man continued his search of the drawers, and found a will of recent date in favor of Clifford, which he destroyed, and an older one in his own favor, which he suffered to remain. But before retiring, Jaffrey bethought himself of the evidence, in these ransacked drawers, that someone had visited the chamber with sinister purposes. Suspicion, unless averted, might fix upon the real offender. In the very presence of the dead man, therefore, he laid a scheme that should free himself at the expense of Clifford, his rival, for whose character he had at once a contempt and a repugnance. It is not probable, be it said, that he acted with any set purpose of involving Clifford in a charge of murder. Knowing that his uncle did not die by violence, it may not have occurred to him in the hurry of the crisis that such an inference might be drawn. But when the affair took this darker aspect, Jaffrey's previous steps had already pledged him to those which remained. So craftily had he arranged the circumstances, that at Clifford's trial his cousin hardly found it necessary to swear to anything false, but only to withhold the one decisive explanation, by refraining to state what he had himself done and witnessed. Thus Jaffrey Pyncheon's inward criminality, as regarded Clifford, was indeed black and damnable, while its mere outward show and positive commission was the smallest that could possibly consist with so great a sin. This is just the sort of guilt that a man of eminent respectability finds it easiest to dispose of. It was suffered to fade out of sight, or be reckoned a venial matter, in the Honorable Judge Pyncheon's long subsequent survey of his own life. He shuffled it aside among the forgotten and forgiven frailties of his youth, and seldom thought of it again. We leave the judge to his repose. He could not be styled fortunate at the hour of death. Unknowingly, he was a childless man, while striving to add more wealth to his only child's inheritance. Hardly a week after his decease, one of the Cunard steamers brought intelligence of the death by cholera of Judge Pyncheon's son, just at the point of embarkation for his native land. By this misfortune Clifford became rich. So did Hepzibah, so did our little village maiden, and, through her, that sworn foe of wealth and all manner of conservatism, the wild reformer, Holgrave. It was now far too late in Clifford's life for the good opinion of society to be worth the trouble and anguish of a formal vindication. What he needed was the love of a very few, not the admiration or even the respect of the unknown many. The latter might probably have been won for him, had those on whom the guardianship of his welfare had fallen deemed it advisable to expose Clifford to a miserable resuscitation of past ideas, when the condition of whatever comfort he might expect lay in the calm of forgetfulness. After such wrong as he had suffered, there is no reparation. The pitiable mockery of it, which the world might have been ready enough to offer, coming so long after the agony had done its utmost work, would have been fit only to provoke bitterer laughter than poor Clifford was ever capable of. It is a truth, and it would be a very sad one, but for the higher hopes which it suggests, that no great mistake, whether acted or endured, in our mortal sphere is ever really set right. Time, the continual vicissitude of circumstances, and the invariable inopportunity of death, render it impossible. If, after long lapse of years, the right seems to be in our power, we find no niche to set it in. The better remedy is for the sufferer to pass on, and leave what he once thought his irreparable ruin far behind him. The shock of Judge Pyncheon's death had a permanently invigorating and ultimately beneficial effect on Clifford. That strong and ponderous man had been Clifford's nightmare. There was no free breath to be drawn within the sphere of so malevolent an influence. The first effect of freedom, as we have witnessed in Clifford's aimless flight, was a tremulous exhilaration. Subsiding from it, he did not sink into his former intellectual apathy. He never, it is true, attained to nearly the full measure of what might have been his faculties, but he recovered enough of them partially to light up his character, to display some outline of the marvelous grace that was abortive in it, and to make him the object of no less deep, although less melancholy interest than heretofore. He was evidently happy. Could we pause to give another picture of his daily life, with all the appliances now at command to gratify his instinct for the beautiful, the garden scenes that seemed so sweet to him would look mean and trivial in comparison. Very soon after their change of fortune, Clifford, Hepzibah, and little Phoebe, with the approval of the artist, concluded to remove from the dismal old house of the Seven Gables, and take up their abode for the present at the elegant country seat of the late Judge Pyncheon. Chanticleer and his family had already been transported thither, where the two hens had forthwith begun an indefatigable process of egg-laying, with an evident design, as a matter of duty and conscience, to continue their illustrious breed under better auspices than for a century past. On the day set for their departure, the principal personages of our story, including good Uncle Venner, were assembled in the parlor. "The country house is certainly a very fine one, so far as the plan goes," observed Holgrave, as the party were discussing their future arrangements. "But I wonder that the late judge, being so opulent, and with a reasonable prospect of transmitting his wealth to descendants of his own, should not have felt the propriety of embodying so excellent a piece of domestic architecture in stone rather than in wood. Then every generation of the family might have altered the interior to suit its own taste and convenience, while the exterior, through the lapse of years, might have been adding venerableness to its original beauty, and thus giving the impression of permanence which I consider essential to the happiness of any one moment." "Why," cried Phoebe, gazing into the artist's face with infinite amazement, "how wonderfully your ideas are changed! A house of stone, indeed! It is but 2 or 3 weeks ago that you seemed to wish people to live in something as fragile and temporary as a bird's nest." "Ah, Phoebe, I told you how it would be," said the artist, with a half-melancholy laugh. "You find me a conservative already. Little did I think ever to become one. It is especially unpardonable in this dwelling of so much hereditary misfortune, and under the eye of yonder portrait of a model conservative, who in that very character rendered himself so long the evil destiny of his race." "That picture," said Clifford, seeming to shrink from its stern glance. "Whenever I look at it, there is an old dreamy recollection haunting me, but keeping just beyond the grasp of my mind. Wealth, it seems to say, boundless wealth, unimaginable wealth. I could fancy that when I was a child or youth that portrait had spoken and told me a rich secret, or had held forth its hand with the written record of hidden opulence. But those old matters are so dim with me nowadays. What could this dream have been?" "Perhaps I can recall it," answered Holgrave. "See, there are 100 chances to 1 that no person unacquainted with the secret would ever touch this spring." "A secret spring!" cried Clifford. Ah, I remember now. I did discover it one summer afternoon, when I was idling and dreaming about the house long, long ago. But the mystery escapes me." The artist put his finger on the contrivance to which he had referred. In former days the effect would probably have been to cause the picture to start forward, but in so long a period of concealment the machinery had been eaten through with rust, so that at Holgrave's pressure the portrait, frame and all, tumbled suddenly from its position and lay face downward on the floor. A recess in the wall was thus brought to light, in which lay an object so covered with a century's dust that it could not immediately be recognized as a folded sheet of parchment. Holgrave opened it and displayed an ancient deed, signed with the hieroglyphics of several Indian sagamores, and conveying to Colonel Pyncheon and his heirs forever a vast extent of territory at the eastward. "This is the very parchment, the attempt to recover which cost the beautiful Alice Pyncheon her happiness and life," said the artist, alluding to his legend. "It is what the Pyncheons sought in vain while it was valuable, and now that they find the treasure, it has long been worthless." "Poor cousin Jaffrey! This is what deceived him," exclaimed Hepzibah. "When they were young together, Clifford probably made a kind of fairy tale of this discovery. He was always dreaming hither and thither about the house, and lighting up its dark corners with beautiful stories. And poor Jaffrey, who took hold of everything as if it were real, thought my brother had found out his uncle's wealth. He died with this delusion in his mind." "But," said Phoebe, apart to Holgrave, "how came you to know the secret?" "My dearest Phoebe," said Holgrave, "how will it please you to assume the name of Maull? As for the secret, it is the only inheritance that has come down to me from my ancestors. You should have known sooner, only that I was afraid of frightening you away. That in this long drama of wrong and retribution, I represent the old wizard, and am probably as much a wizard as ever he was. The son of the executed Matthew Maull, while building this house, took the opportunity to construct that recess and hide away the Indian deed, on which depended the immense land claim of the Pyncheons. Thus they bartered their eastern territory for Maull's garden ground." "And now," said Uncle Venner, "I suppose their whole claim is not worth one man's share in my farm yonder."
"Uncle Venner," cried Phoebe, taking the patched philosopher's hand, "you must never talk any more about your farm. You shall never go there as long as you live. There is a cottage in our new garden, the prettiest little yellowish-brown cottage you ever saw, and the sweetest looking place, for it looks just as if it were made of gingerbread. And we are going to fit it up and finish it on purpose for you. And you shall do nothing but what you choose, and shall be as happy as the day is long, and shall keep cousin Clifford in spirits with the wisdom and pleasantness which is always dropping from your lips."
"Ah, my dear child," quoth good Uncle Venner, quite overcome, "if you were to speak to a young man as you do to an old one, his chance of keeping his heart another minute would not be worth one of the buttons on my waistcoat. And soul alive, that great sigh which you made me heave has burst off the very last of them. But never mind, it was the happiest sigh I ever did heave, and it seems as if I must have drawn in a gulp of heavenly breath to make it with. Well, well, Miss Phoebe, they'll miss me in the gardens hereabouts and round by the back doors, and Pyncheon Street, I'm afraid, will hardly look the same without old Uncle Venner, who remembers it with a mowing field on one side, and the garden of the Seven Gables on the other. But either I must go to your country seat, or you must come to my farm. That's one of two things certain, and I'll leave you to choose which."
"Oh, come with us by all means, Uncle Venner,"
said Clifford, who had a remarkable enjoyment of the old man's mellow, quiet, and simple spirit.
"I want you always to be within 5 minutes' saunter of my chair. You are the only philosopher I ever knew of whose wisdom has not a drop of bitter essence at the bottom.
Dear me!" cried Uncle Venner, beginning partly to realize what manner of man he was. "And yet folks used to set me down among the simple ones, in my younger days. But I suppose I am like a Roxbury russet, a great deal the better the longer I can be kept. Yes, and my words of wisdom that you and Phoebe tell me of are like the golden dandelions, which never grow in the hot months, but may be seen glistening among the withered grass and under the dry leaves sometimes as late as December. And you are welcome, friends, to my mess of dandelions, if there were twice as many."
A plain but handsome dark green barouche has now drawn up in front of the ruinous portal of the old mansion house. The party came forth, and, with the exception of good Uncle Venner, who was to follow in a few days, proceeded to take their places. They were chatting and laughing very pleasantly together, and, as proves to be often the case, at moments when we ought to palpitate with sensibility, Clifford and Hepzibah bade a final farewell to the abode of their forefathers, with hardly more emotion than if they had made it their arrangement to return thither at tea-time. Several children were drawn to the spot by so unusual a spectacle as the barouche and a pair of grey horses. Recognizing little Ned Higgins among them, Hepzibah put her hand into her pocket and presented the urchin, her earliest and staunchest customer, with silver enough to people the Dom Daniel cavern of his interior with as various a procession of quadrupeds as passed into the ark. Two men were passing just as the barouche drove off.
"Well, Dixie," said one of them, "what do you think of this? My wife kept a cent shop 3 months and lost $5 on her outlay. Old maid Pyncheon has been in trade just about as long, and rides off in her carriage with a couple of 100,000, reckoning her share and Clifford's and Phoebe's, and some say twice as much. If you choose to call it luck, it is all very well, but if we are to take it as the will of Providence, why, I can't exactly fathom it."
"Pretty good business," quoth the sagacious Dixie. "Pretty good business." Malswell, all this time, though left in solitude, was throwing up a succession of kaleidoscopic pictures, in which a gifted eye might have seen foreshadowed the coming fortunes of Hepzibah and Clifford, and the descendant of the legendary wizard and the village maiden, over whom he had thrown love's web of sorcery. The Pyncheon elm, moreover, with what foliage the September gale had spared to it, whispered unintelligible prophecies. And wise Uncle Venner, passing slowly from the ruinous porch, seemed to hear a strain of music, and fancied that sweet Alice Pyncheon, after witnessing these deeds, this bygone woe and this present happiness, of her kindred mortals, had given one farewell touch of a spirit's joy upon her harpsichord, as she floated heavenward from the house of the Seven Gables. End of chapter 21. End of The House of the Seven Gables by Nathaniel Hawthorne.